Thanks to the rather far-fetched mid-1970s television series Black Sheep Squadron, the iconic bent-wing silhouette of the Chance-Vought F4U Corsair has become one of the most vivid and enduring images of World War II aviation in the minds of most Americans. Week after week, audiences were thrilled by the dark blue forms of VMF 214's Corsairs streaking across their television screens, as the fictionalized exploits of the squadron, led by the legendary Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, were dramatized against the backdrop of the Solomon Islands in 1943. The series portrayed daring dogfights with sinister Japanese aces, and while the stories themselves were often embellished or wholly invented, the airplanes were real, and the series drew inspiration from the actual men who had flown these fighters years earlier, when the Corsair had become a symbol of Marine Corps aviation prowess. For readers and aviation enthusiasts wanting a deeper dive into military aviation history, Military Heritage magazine provides detailed accounts and analysis of aircraft, pilots, and their impact on the war. The development of the F4U Corsair was driven by the U.S. Navy's desire for a high-performance carrier-based fighter capable of dominating the skies above the fleet. United Aircraft's Vought division submitted the design in response to a 1938 Navy requirement, and the design team built the aircraft around the powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine. This radial engine, with its twin banks of 9 cylinders, promised unprecedented power, and Vaught's engineers sought to harness that power efficiently. To do so, they paired the engine with an unusually large propeller, a choice that necessitated an elongated fuselage to prevent the propeller tips from striking the ground. While this decision allowed the engine to operate optimally, it created significant problems for pilot visibility. On the ground, the long nose of the Corsair severely restricted the pilot's view, making taxiing hazardous, while in the air, it hindered forward sight during approaches to landing, particularly on the deck of an aircraft carrier. Ironically, this limitation proved less critical in Marine Corps service, where the Corsair's high performance was a more pressing need than perfect carrier compatibility. One of the most recognizable features of the Corsair was the gull wing design, a solution born out of necessity rather than aesthetics. The massive propeller required either longer landing gear or a creative approach to avoid striking the ground. Rather than extending the struts, which would have been difficult to stow on a carrier aircraft, the engineers bent the wings downward near the fuselage, creating the iconic inverted gull shape. This design allowed shorter, stronger landing gear to be used while keeping the propeller safely above the ground. The distinctive wings set the Corsair apart visually from nearly all other World War II fighters, with the only similar configuration being the German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. The design also contributed indirectly to the plane's durability and agility, factors that would become vital in the Pacific theater. By spring 1940, the prototype Corsair was ready for flight, and on May 29, it lifted off from the Vought factory in Bridgeport, Connecticut, marking the beginning of a long and challenging testing program. Some sources place the first flight in late April, but May 29 is generally considered correct. Early flights were plagued by mechanical difficulties, and the fifth test ended disastrously when the prototype ran out of fuel and had to crash land on a golf course. Although the airframe was salvageable, significant damage delayed the program. By October, the plane was flying again, achieving a remarkable average ground speed of 405 miles per hour during a flight from Bridgeport to Hartford. While modern sources sometimes claim this as the first instance of a fighter exceeding 400 miles per hour, it is important to note that this was ground speed, boosted by a tailwind. Other contemporary aircraft, such as Lockheed's XP-38 and Republic's P-47 prototypes, had already reached comparable speeds, and later Corsair models would surpass 450 miles per hour. The first production F4US rolled off the assembly line in June 1942, but the fighter's early promise was tempered by practical challenges. The long nose and poor forward visibility made the Corsair difficult for inexperienced pilots to handle, earning it the unflattering nickname, the Ensign Eliminator. Test pilots quickly realized the aircraft required exceptional skill, and initial carrier trials revealed that the plane was not yet suitable for shipboard operations. Meanwhile, the U.S. Marine Corps, facing urgent combat needs in the Southwest Pacific, could not wait for the Navy to approve the Corsair. Marine squadrons were still flying the outdated Grumman F4F Wildcat, which was increasingly inadequate against Japanese bombers at high altitude. Recognizing the Corsair's potential, the Navy assigned it to the Marines, while the Grumman F6F Hellcat, also powered by the R2800 engine, became the Navy's primary fighter. This division of labor allowed both services to field competitive aircraft while addressing their specific operational needs. By 1942, both the Navy and Marine Corps were struggling to rebuild their air power after heavy carrier losses in the battles of Coral Sea and Midway. Carrier aviation was temporarily out of the war, giving the Navy time to refine the Hellcat and later integrate the Corsair into carrier service. In the meantime, the Marines had a high-performance fighter capable of intercepting enemy aircraft, gaining a technological edge in the Pacific that would prove decisive in subsequent battles. The F4U Corsair, with its unique combination of speed, firepower, and maneuverability, would go on to earn a legendary reputation, symbolizing American ingenuity, resilience, and the intense combat of the Pacific theater. Its distinctive gull wings and powerful engine made it a fighter unlike any other, a plane that both challenged pilots and inspired generations of aviators and enthusiasts alike. The Marines, meanwhile, had been deployed to the South and Southwest Pacific, where U.S. forces were engaged in fierce combat with Japanese troops over key islands such as Guadalcanal. The air war in the region was intense, and the Corps' Grumman F4F Wildcats, while reliable, struggled to match the speed and altitude capabilities of the Japanese bombers that regularly targeted Henderson Field. Despite this, the skill and determination of the Marine pilots often allowed them to hold their own in the air. By climbing to altitude ahead of incoming enemy formations or engaging Japanese aircraft at lower altitudes where performance differences were less pronounced, Marine aviators could still inflict significant damage, disrupting bomber raids and protecting vital ground positions. Complementing the Marines were Army P-39 Airacobras and P-40 Warhawks, based at Henderson as part of the so-called Cactus Air Force. While these Army fighters offered some advantages over the Wildcats, particularly in raw firepower, they too struggled to climb fast enough to intercept bomber formations before they reached their targets. In this context, the F4U Corsair promised a new level of performance, with the speed, climb rate, and armament needed to counter high-flying Japanese aircraft. However, by the time Corsairs were ready for combat, the Battle of Guadalcanal had already been decided, and the Marines would initially employ the aircraft more in escort and ground attack roles than as interceptors. The first Marine squadron to receive the F4U Corsair was VMF 124, which became operational by the end of 1942. The squadron was immediately dispatched to Guadalcanal, arriving during the night of February 11th to 12th, and the very next morning the pilots flew their first missions, including rescue sorties, logging 9 hours of flight by the end of the day. On February 13th, a flight of 12 Corsairs from VMF 124 escorted 13th Air Force B-24 bombers to Bougainville, marking the longest escort mission undertaken in the Solomon Islands up to that point. The following day, the Corsair faced its first real combat when VMF 124 contributed aircraft to a joint service operation that included Army P-38s and P-40s, Navy Liberators, and Marine Corsairs. The mission proved costly. 8 American fighters and 2 bombers were lost, including 2 Corsairs, one of which collided with one of the 3 Japanese Mitsubishi A6M0s shot down that day. This inauspicious beginning highlighted the challenges of integrating a new fighter into combat operations, as well as the steep learning curve faced by pilots adapting to a radically new aircraft. Despite these early setbacks, VMF 124 soon demonstrated the Corsair's potential. On February 14th, further daylight operations were temporarily suspended to allow time for fighter strength to build up, and night raids became the focus until the squadron could resume more aggressive missions. Daylight strikes resumed on March 28th, with 8 VMF 124 Corsairs participating in an attack against the Shetlands, though 7 Corsairs turned back, as did 3 of the P-38s. The remaining aircraft engaged Japanese Nakajima floatplane fighters, downing 8 of them, marking a turning point in operational effectiveness for the squadron. It was around this time that Corsair pilots began to distinguish themselves individually, most notably Second Lieutenant Ken Walsh. Walsh, a former enlisted pilot recently commissioned as an officer, had extensive experience in observation planes, scout bombers, and fighters, dating back to 1938. On one mission, his flight of Corsairs returned to support Army P-38s and P-40s under attack, and Walsh personally accounted for 3 Japanese Zeros, earning him the distinction of being the first Corsair ace and putting him on the path to receiving the Medal of Honor. Walsh and his squadron faced continued challenges, including missing major battles due to rest rotations. On April 7, VMF 124 was away in Australia when radar detected a large Japanese force targeting the Russell Islands. 76 fighters, comprising Army P-38s and P-39s and Marine F-4FS and F-4US, intercepted the enemy. The Army pilots claimed 13 of the 39 Japanese aircraft shot down, while Marine and Navy fighters accounted for the remainder. By May, VMF 124 had returned to action, and on May 13, Walsh became the first Corsair ace by downing 3 additional Zeros, bringing his total to 6. This proved that the feared Mitsubishi Zero was no longer invincible against U.S. naval fighters. By mid-August, Walsh had achieved AA status with 10 kills, and on August 15, despite being heavily outnumbered, he shot down 3 more enemy planes before his Corsair was damaged in combat. That same month, on August 30, Walsh performed the heroic actions that would cement his Medal of Honor recognition. During an escort mission for Navy liberators attacking Kahili Airfield on Bougainville, Walsh's engine failed, forcing him to land at Vella La Vella. Undeterred, he took another Corsair and rejoined the formation, confronting roughly 50 Zeeks attacking the liberators. He shot down 4 more enemy aircraft before his own plane was shot down, plunging into the sea. He was rescued and sent home to receive the Medal of Honor, though he would return later to fly Corsairs with VMF 222 in the Philippines, finishing the war with 21 confirmed kills, his final victory being a kamikaze intercepted during the Battle of Okinawa. Walsh's career exemplified the Corsair's impact in skilled hands, a fighter capable of reshaping air combat and bolstering the Marines' dominance in the Pacific. The Swashbuckler. Among the many Marine Corps fighter squadrons that flew the legendary F4U Corsair, few became as famous as VMF 214, largely because of the colorful personality of one of its commanders and the squadron's daring exploits. Initially, VMF 214 entered combat a few days after VMF 124, though at first the unit was equipped with older F4F Wildcats during its first tour. After a period of rest and re-equipping with Corsairs, the squadron returned to action in June 1943, and it was around this time that the unit truly began to distinguish itself. On August 6, the squadron, soon to be nicknamed the Swashbucklers, produced its first ace in the form of former enlisted pilot Al Jensen, who shot down a Japanese Jake fighter and 2 Mitsubishi Zeros, adding to the 2 victories he had already scored while flying Wildcats. Jensen's skill and daring did not go unnoticed, and on August 28, he was awarded the Navy Cross following a particularly audacious strike against the Japanese airfield at Kahili. Although he was officially credited with destroying 15 aircraft on the ground, aerial reconnaissance photographs taken the following day revealed that 24 planes had been obliterated in the attack. In early September, the squadron's personnel departed for Australia in preparation for their return to the United States, and in doing so, the original VMF 214 was disbanded, with a designation transferred to a newly formed unit in the Pacific Theater. Major Gregory Boyington and the Black Sheep. The enduring fame of VMF 214 owes as much to the exploits of its commander, Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, as to the squadron's combat record. Hollywood producer Stephen J. Cannell immortalized the squadron in the 1970s television series Black Sheep Squadron, portraying the men as a motley band of drunken misfits. While this dramatization did not sit well with the aging veterans who had actually flown and fought in the unit, it captured something of Boyington's personal reputation. A pre-war Marine Corps pilot, Boyington had left the service to fight in China with the American Volunteer Group, partly to earn money to pay off substantial debts. Credited with 6 Japanese planes, 3 of them destroyed on the ground, he fell afoul of General Claire Chennault and went AWOL, earning a dishonorable discharge. Ordinarily, Such a record would have ended a military aviation career, but by mid-1942 experienced combat pilots were in short supply. The Marine Corps reinstated him and awarded him the rank of major, recognizing the value of his skill and experience. Boyington arrived at Guadalcanal in early 1943 and initially served as a staff officer before taking command of VMF 122, which was still equipped with Wildcats. Personality conflicts with a superior officer, dating back to pre-war service, made Boyington's tenure in that position contentious, and by mid-September he was assigned an administrative role, coordinating replacement pilots and their assignments to combat units. With a shortage of active squadrons in the Solomons and a growing number of pilots in the theater who were unassigned, Boyington, according to his memoirs, suggested forming a new squadron composed of these surplus pilots. Whether to accommodate his initiative or to remove him from desk duty, the staff of Marine Air Wing 1 agreed, and Boyington was placed in command of the new VMF 214. Under his leadership, the unit would soon carve out a reputation for daring raids, aggressive dogfighting tactics, and an esprit de corps that earned it legendary status in the annals of Marine Corps aviation history. 26 pilots were carefully assembled to form the nucleus of what would soon become one of the most legendary units in Marine Corps aviation history. Among them were 8 men who had previously flown with VMF 122 under Major Gregory Pappy Boyington, bringing a degree of familiarity and cohesion to the fledgling squadron. A few others came with combat experience from different Corsair units, while 3 had served with the Royal Canadian Air Force, contributing valuable international experience. 4 had worked as instructors in Corsairs in the United States, bringing technical expertise and teaching skills to the group, and several others had been flying the older F4F Wildcats in the Pacific Theater. Overall, the men selected for this new unit were a highly experienced and capable bunch, a collection of pilots who had flown a variety of aircraft and engaged in combat missions, but who had until now lacked a shared identity or a unit of their own. With the original VMF 214 pilots sent back to the United States, the squadron faced a choice regarding its identity. The men decided to discard the old swashbucklers name in favor of a new moniker that better reflected their status as a disparate group with no familial or historical connection within the Corps. They became known simply as the Black Sheep, a name that symbolized their outsider status and the unconventional spirit they would bring to combat. By September, the Black Sheep were operational and had moved to their combat base in the Russell Islands. On the 14th of that month, they flew their first combat mission, marking the beginning of an extraordinary 84-day period in which they achieved one of the most impressive combat records in aviation history. During this stretch, VMF 214 was credited with destroying or damaging over 200 Japanese aircraft both in the air and on the ground, in addition to striking dozens of barges, supply depots, and other ground targets. Of those 200 engagements, 94 were confirmed air-to-air kills, demonstrating the squadron's lethal efficiency in aerial combat. At the forefront of this remarkable record was Major Boyington himself. By January 3, 1944, when he was shot down over Rabaul, Boyington had amassed 22 victories in Corsairs, and when combined with his 6 victories from his time with the American Volunteer Group, his total stood at 28. Captured by the Japanese, he spent the remainder of the war as a prisoner of war. In recognition of his valor, Boyington was awarded the Medal of Honor following the war. The loss of their commander marked a turning point for VMF 214, which was briefly disbanded after receiving a Presidential Unit Citation, only to be reactivated later in the war as a Corsair squadron operating from the carrier USS Franklin. Meanwhile, the F4U Corsair played a pivotal role in bringing famed aviator Charles Lindbergh into direct contact with combat operations. Blackballed politically due to his outspoken opposition to U.S. involvement in the European theater and the pre-war resignation of his Army Air Corps Commission, Lindbergh initially sought a role in the aviation industry. In early 1942, United Aircraft President Eugene Wilson, a personal friend, offered him a position with the company, but under pressure from the White House, the offer was rescinded. Lindbergh instead accepted a role with Henry Ford, whose company was engaged in the massive production of war materials, including the B-24 Liberator, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and Pratt & Whitney engines. While at Ford, Lindbergh became involved in high-altitude research on fighter aircraft, demonstrating his technical skill and deep understanding of aviation. United Aircraft soon renewed its invitation, and by spring 1944, Lindbergh was fully engaged in research and development for the Corsair program. Drawing on his extensive experience as a military pilot, he flew Corsairs in training maneuvers with Marine units and even engaged in mock dogfights against some of the Corps' best pilots, emerging victorious in multiple instances, which earned him the respect of Marine aviation leadership. Lindbergh's involvement with the Corsair program naturally brought him into contact with numerous military leaders, and in the spring of 1944 he attended a meeting with Marine Corps representatives in Washington, D.C. During the discussion, he highlighted that United Aircraft was receiving conflicting reports regarding the performance and effectiveness of single versus twin-engine fighters. He suggested that someone with direct Corsair experience should travel to the Pacific Theater to observe the aircraft in actual combat conditions. Marine Brigadier General Lewis would responded pragmatically, asking, "Why don't you go?" Lindbergh, aware of the ongoing political sensitivities with the White House, hesitated, citing his strained relationship with the administration. General Wood reassured him, stating that the White House did not need to be involved and that he would make the necessary arrangements for Lindbergh's observation tour, thereby setting the stage for the legendary aviator to contribute his expertise directly to the operational use of the F4U Corsair in combat. In April 1944, Charles Lindbergh embarked on a journey to the South Pacific as a Corsair technical representative, carrying the authorization to fly combat missions in an observational capacity. His mission began with a cross-country flight to deliver a Corsair to the Marine Airfield at El Toro, California, where he spent a few days visiting Marine fighter squadrons, speaking with pilots, and observing operations firsthand. From California, Lindbergh proceeded to Hawaii, taking the time to visit bases and interact with fighter pilots, including a stop at the strategic Midway Atoll before continuing on to the South Pacific. Once there, he visited Marine squadrons stationed at Espiritu Santo and Guadalcanal, gaining an understanding of the operational challenges faced by the pilots in the theater. Lindbergh officially began flying combat missions out of Green Island on May 22, and while there was initially some reluctance among senior Marine officers to allow a civilian to participate in combat operations, his cautious initial flights proved uneventful, and soon the Lone Eagle was actively flying missions in the South Pacific skies. By June 10, he had completed 13 missions, which included both escort operations and strafing attacks against Japanese barges. Although he briefly left the Marines to fly P-38s with the Army Air Forces, he returned to the Marine squadrons at Kwajalein and Tarawa for additional weeks of operational support before making his way back to the United States, with brief stops in the Marshall Islands and Guam along the way. During his second deployment with Marine units, Lindbergh made a significant impact on tactics and the utilization of the F4U Corsair. He instructed pilots in advanced dive bombing techniques and demonstrated that the Corsair could carry significantly larger bomb loads than previously believed. On September 3, 1944, he proved the fighter's capability by dropping 3 1,000-pound bombs on Watch Atoll, and 5 days later, he expanded this to a 4,000-pound load, combining one 2,000-pound bomb with two 1,000-pound bombs in a single mission. In addition to enhancing bombing tactics, Lindbergh taught pilots how to conserve fuel by flying at lower engine RPMs while maintaining higher manifold pressure, a method that extended the Corsair's combat range by several hundred miles. This technique allowed fighter pilots to escort bombers deeper into Japanese-held territory than had previously been possible, increasing operational flexibility and enhancing the strategic reach of U.S. aviation forces. While the Marines were establishing the F4U Corsair's reputation in combat, the airplane's intended role as a carrier-based fighter had remained largely untested in U.S. service. The long nose and visibility issues that had hindered Navy adoption left the Corsair restricted to land-based operations with Marine squadrons for over a year. It was the Royal Navy that ultimately demonstrated the aircraft's carrier-borne capabilities. British pilots developed a novel curving approach to landings, which allowed them to keep the landing signals officer in sight until the Corsair was in the proper landing groove. Once aligned, the pilots could simply cut power, touch down, engage the arresting wires, and be halted safely without the need for taxiing, as the aircraft were then towed or pushed clear of the deck. This method proved so effective that the U.S. Navy adopted it, equipping some of its own squadrons with Corsairs and making plans to deploy Marine squadrons aboard carriers once the pilots completed carrier qualification. The first U.S. Navy Corsair squadron to see combat was VF-17, famously known as the Jolly Rogers. Organized in early 1943 for assignment to the Essex-class carrier Bunker Hill, VF-17 was initially intended to operate as a land-based unit due to special considerations. The Corsair had not been a popular aircraft among Navy pilots, many of whom were wary of its long nose, challenging landing characteristics, and initial reputation for difficulty. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, VF-17's commanding officer, shared this skepticism but gradually became convinced of the aircraft's strengths after extensive testing and evaluation. Under his leadership, the squadron underwent intensive training at Norfolk, Virginia, and along the Outer Banks of North Carolina, refining tactics and familiarizing themselves with the Corsair's capabilities. Shortly after the Bunker Hill was launched at Quincy, Massachusetts, in July 1943, VF-17 joined the carrier and prepared to bring the F4U Corsair into its first operational naval engagements, establishing a model for integrating the fighter into carrier-based operations and ultimately demonstrating that, despite initial doubts, the Corsair was a formidable asset both in the air and at sea. The Corsair's operational challenges were immediately apparent to Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn and the pilots of VF-17, yet Blackburn made the deliberate decision to turn down an offer to replace their F-4US with a newly arriving Grumman F-6F Hellcat, which was just beginning to enter the U.S. Navy inventory. In September 1943, the carrier Bunker Hill set out for the Pacific Theater, transiting the Panama Canal and making a stop in San Diego. The men of VF-17 had anticipated participating in the carrier's first operational sorties in the Pacific, flying off the deck in their Corsairs for a combat tour. However, shortly after departing San Diego, the plan was unexpectedly altered. Blackburn received orders to return his squadron to San Diego, and instead of engaging in the initial carrier operations, VF-17 was redirected to Espiritu Santo for land-based duty. Although the squadron had already demonstrated that they could operate a Corsair from a carrier, a new logistical challenge emerged. As the Navy's only operational Corsair squadron at the time, VF-17 faced unique supply issues. Maintaining the airplanes would require specialized parts, and procuring replacements for a single squadron through standard channels would be difficult and slow. To alleviate this problem, the Navy assigned VF-17 to the Solomons, where Marine F4U squadrons were already operational and spare parts were readily available, ensuring maintenance and combat readiness could be sustained. Once in the Solomons, VF-17 quickly became a formidable force. The squadron arrived on Guadalcanal in late October before relocating to their new base on New Georgia. Over the ensuing months, VF-17 pilots achieved remarkable success, with 13 squadron members reaching ace status. Their operations focused on neutralizing Rabaul, a heavily fortified Japanese stronghold. During early November, members of VF-17 even briefly landed on Bunker Hill to refuel and rearm while participating in the initial carrier attacks on the island. With bases positioned closer to Rabaul, Allied aircraft could effectively strike the Japanese stronghold, while submarines, carrier aircraft, and land-based bombers restricted reinforcements and resupply. During January, when the battle for Rabaul peaked, VF-17 fighters alone were credited with 60.5 Japanese aircraft destroyed. With the Japanese unable to replace their losses, the intensity of combat around Rabaul gradually diminished. By early March, VF-17 was relieved, and the squadron was deactivated as the focus of the war shifted further north into the Central Pacific. While VF-17 and Marine Corsair squadrons gained recognition for air superiority missions and attacking Japanese shore installations, their role in close air support, CAS, was equally significant, though it would develop more fully later. Throughout the Solomons campaign, Corsair missions included escorting bombers, attacking airfields, harassing Japanese coastal shipping, and engaging barges along the shoreline. As Japanese air defenses weakened, the U.S. Marine Corps began training Corsair squadrons for CAS missions, a role that had first been experimented with using F-4FS and Army P-39s during the Guadalcanal campaign. Although the value of air support in direct support of ground troops had been recognized by the Marine Corps as early as the 1920s in Central America, the mission had not been fully integrated into marine aviation doctrine, and planning for Guadalcanal had overlooked its importance. It was during the Battle of Bloody Ridge, later known as Edson's Ridge, that CAS demonstrated its decisive impact. On the morning of September 14, 1942, after the Marines requested assistance, 3 Bell P-400s from the Army's 67th Fighter Squadron launched strafing runs at the Japanese forces attacking the ridge. 2 were damaged by ground fire, but the third persisted, repeatedly strafing enemy positions until ammunition was exhausted, inflicting massive casualties and forcing survivors to retreat. General Alexander A. Vandegrift, commander of U.S. Marine Forces on Guadalcanal, personally commended the pilots, acknowledging that their actions had been pivotal in determining the outcome of the battle. Following Guadalcanal, close air support became an increasingly emphasized mission within the Marine Corps, although the F4U Corsair would not fully assume this role for nearly 2 years. During planning for operations at Tarawa and across the Central Pacific, CAS missions were primarily assigned to Douglas SBD dive bombers and F-6F Hellcats, yet Marine Corsair squadrons began conducting dive bombing sorties in preparation for this capability. Lindbergh's earlier demonstrations that the Corsair could safely carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs further cemented the aircraft's importance as a ground attack weapon. By combining the Corsair's speed, firepower, and bomb-carrying capacity with carefully developed tactics for strafing and dive bombing, the aircraft evolved into a versatile tool capable of both air-to-air combat and powerful support of ground operations, ultimately proving indispensable in the Pacific theater. As the war progressed, the versatility and firepower of the F4U Corsair were continually expanded to meet the evolving demands of the Pacific theater. In addition to carrying high-explosive bombs, the Navy began equipping the Corsair with a new high-velocity aircraft rockets, which had been developed to provide pilots with a devastatingly effective weapon against ground and sea targets. To accommodate these rockets, hardpoints were installed under the wings, allowing each fighter to carry up to 8 rockets, which supplemented the firepower of its 6.50 caliber machine guns during strafing missions. Beyond rockets and conventional bombs, the Corsairs were also modified to carry napalm, giving the pilots the ability to deliver devastating incendiary attacks against fortified positions, troop concentrations, and supply depots. These modifications transformed the Corsair from a high-performance fighter into a versatile multi-role strike aircraft capable of engaging both aerial and ground targets with lethal efficiency. By late 1944, the Department of the Navy had officially designated the F4U Corsair as its primary close air support (CAS) aircraft, reflecting both its adaptability and the aircraft's successful integration into carrier operations. Prior to this, Marine fighter squadrons were not assigned to carriers, and most Marine pilots were not carrier qualified due to the increasing need for Navy aviators to staff the growing number of squadrons for the new Essex-class fast carriers. With the Solomons campaign concluded and ground-based squadrons in the Central Pacific becoming less critical, numerous Marine squadrons were reassigned to the fleet to participate in carrier operations, primarily with a mission of providing direct CAS for Marines during amphibious assaults. This marked a significant evolution in the role of marine aviation, as the Corsair now became an indispensable tool for supporting frontline troops while also retaining its air-to-air combat capabilities. The landing on Iwo Jima in early 1945 marked the first major operation in which the Corsair served as the primary CAS aircraft. VMF 124 led the initial assault, sending 24 F4Us in conjunction with an equal number of F6FS from Essex-class carriers to deliver a combination of napalm, rockets, and strafing runs against Japanese positions on the beaches. These missions were highly effective, disrupting enemy fortifications and inflicting significant casualties, though Marine squadrons were stationed over Iwo Jima for only 3 days. The growing threat of kamikaze attacks prompted the Navy to redirect the Corsairs north to attack air bases on Honshu, temporarily leaving the Marines without CAS support until Army fighters could be deployed to fill the gap. Similarly, during the invasion of Okinawa, Corsairs were originally intended to provide direct support for the Marines, but the intensity and frequency of kamikaze attacks forced Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the operation, to order the fighters to conduct combat air patrols instead, protecting the fleet from incoming suicide bombers rather than engaging in direct ground attacks. The Corsair would later play a pivotal role during the campaign to liberate the Philippines, as two Marine aircraft groups, MAG-12 and MAG-14, made a nearly 2,000-mile journey from the Solomons to take up positions on Leyte and Samar. The Corsairs of MAG-12 were integrated with the Army's 308th Bombardment Wing of the 5th Air Force to conduct operations against Japanese forces attempting to reinforce Leyte. Although the initial plan had envisioned an exclusively Army air campaign, senior Marine officers leveraged their influence under General Douglas MacArthur's command to secure a role for Marine squadrons. The first Corsairs arrived at Tacloban in early December 1944 and immediately began combat operations under Army supervision, participating in interception and ground attack missions alongside P-38s and P-40s. These operations were not without hazards, as the aviators had to navigate not only enemy resistance but also the occasional friendly fire incidents. One pilot, Lieutenant R.M. Robinson, was famously shot down by a PT boat and subsequently rescued by the same vessel. Despite the dangers, MAG-12 Corsairs achieved remarkable results in their first month of operations in the Philippines. In addition to suffering losses of 9 pilots and 34 aircraft, the group accounted for more than 40 Japanese planes destroyed and inflicted significant damage on Japanese shipping, sinking 7 destroyers, 9 freighters, and 3 troop transports, with at least 11 additional ships damaged. MAG-14 followed MAG-12 to Samar in early January 1945, joining the ongoing operations in the southern Philippines. By this time, the Leyte campaign was nearing its conclusion, and the focus of the war in the region was shifting to subsequent operations. Together, MAG-12 and MAG-14 continued to employ the Corsairs' firepower in ground attack and interdiction missions, demonstrating the aircraft's unique ability to provide both air superiority and close air support across a vast theater of operations. Among the pilots of MAG-14 was the seasoned ace Ken Walsh, now holding the rank of captain, whose combat experience in Corsairs had already earned him a distinguished record. By this stage of the war, Marine pilots had refined their tactics for attacking enemy shipping, often flying at extremely low altitudes to maximize accuracy and surprise, a method that may have been inspired by the successes of Army light and medium bombers operating in New Guinea. On February 23, 1945, a flight of 4 Corsairs achieved a notable milestone off the coast of Cebu when they encountered a Japanese submarine on the surface. During their initial attack, the pilots failed to sink either of the 2 subs they spotted and were forced to return to base to rearm after expending their bombs. Undeterred, the Corsairs returned to the target and executed a daring wave-top skip-bombing maneuver using 1,000-pound bombs. One of the submarines was sent to the bottom, marking what is believed to be the first submarine sunk by Corsairs, a testament to the adaptability and ingenuity of Marine aviators operating in challenging conditions. By February 1945, Marine aircraft had fully embraced the role of close air support for ground troops, a mission they had initially been restricted from performing in the Philippines. Corsairs, along with Marine SBD Dauntless dive bombers, were actively engaged in supporting Army units and guerrilla forces operating in the rugged terrain of Mindanao and northern Luzon. General George C. Kenney, commander of the Far East Air Forces, had been initially skeptical of close air support, fearing that reliance on airstrikes might diminish the aggressiveness and initiative of ground troops. Nevertheless, the Corsairs' precision strikes and concentrated firepower proved invaluable in aiding indigenous guerrilla forces, providing the heavy support necessary to overcome entrenched Japanese positions despite the guerrillas' lack of artillery and other heavy weapons. As the war shifted closer to Japan, the Corsair returned to its original purpose as a fleet defense fighter, and its most critical contributions came during the Battle of Okinawa, where it faced the formidable threat of Japanese kamikaze attacks. During this period, nearly 1,000 enemy aircraft were launched from airfields on Kyushu and Formosa with the express purpose of striking the Allied fleet. The Corsair's superior speed and climb performance, compared with the F-6F Hellcat, made it particularly effective at intercepting incoming kamikaze formations before they could reach the ships. Popular myths have suggested that the F2G variant of the Corsair was developed specifically to counter kamikaze attacks, but this is incorrect. The F2G had been in development before the Japanese adopted kamikaze tactics, and was originally intended as a high-performance interceptor against conventional air threats. Only a few F2GS were produced, and the program was curtailed as the war approached its conclusion. The Corsair's initial encounters with kamikazes were challenging. During one engagement off Leyte, a formation of 9 bomb-laden Zeros managed to penetrate the fighter screen protecting the fleet, striking the small escort carriers operating offshore. The most severe damage was sustained by the escort carrier St. Lo, which ultimately sank, highlighting the devastating potential of kamikaze attacks. In response, the Navy developed specialized tactics to minimize the threat, emphasizing interception far from the main fleet. Commander John S. Thatch introduced the concept of the Big Blue Blanket, which involved maintaining continuous fighter patrols over and around the fleet to intercept enemy aircraft as early as possible. Corsairs and Hellcats were stationed at sea, operating in conjunction with airstrikes on Japanese airfields to suppress further attacks. Thanks to these innovative tactics and the skill of the pilots, the ferocious kamikaze campaign during the Okinawa operation caused far less strategic damage than anticipated. Although approximately 1,500 kamikaze aircraft were launched from Kyushu and Formosa, only a small fraction succeeded in reaching the fleet. While some destroyers and smaller ships serving on picket duty sustained heavy damage, none of the capital ships or aircraft carriers were sunk, demonstrating the effectiveness of the Corsair and other Allied fighters in defending the fleet against what was, in many ways, the most desperate and deadly phase of Japanese aerial warfare. The combination of superior aircraft performance, tactical ingenuity, and highly trained pilots ensured that the F4U Corsair fulfilled its dual role as both a lethal ground attack aircraft and an outstanding fleet interceptor during the final campaigns of the Pacific War. The remarkable effectiveness of the F4U Corsair was vividly demonstrated during the climactic battles in the final months of the Pacific War, particularly during the intense operations surrounding Okinawa. On April 22, 1945, Corsair pilots from VMF 323 played a crucial role in countering a major kamikaze attack targeting Allied picket ships positioned north of Okinawa at dusk. Facing a force of approximately 80 incoming kamikazes, the VMF 323 pilots quickly engaged the enemy, shooting down an astonishing 23 of the attackers in a matter of minutes. Among the squadron's pilots, 3, including the squadron commander, Major George Axtell, achieved the remarkable feat of downing 5 or more enemy aircraft each during the engagement. The battle unfolded under challenging conditions, with low cloud cover and intermittent rain showers complicating visibility and maneuvering. Over the course of their combat tour, Axtell and his men were credited with an incredible 124.5 Japanese aircraft destroyed, the vast majority of them kamikaze attackers, solidifying the squadron's reputation as one of the most formidable fighter units in the Pacific theater. During the Okinawa campaign, Marine Corsair squadrons operated from both carriers and land bases, particularly the captured airfields at Kadena and Yomitan. Even as Japanese forces still controlled parts of the southern island, Corsair pilots regularly took off and landed on these forward airfields to conduct operations, demonstrating both courage and skill. Land-based Corsairs played a vital role in providing continuous combat air patrols over Allied naval forces, unencumbered by the limitations of carrier operations such as deck space and the need for catapults or arresting gear. Their superior speed and climb performance made Corsairs the aircraft of choice for intercepting kamikazes, providing an essential protective screen for the fleet. By the end of the battle, Marine F4Us were credited with shooting down 506 of the approximately 3,000 Japanese aircraft deployed during the campaign, roughly half of which were kamikazes, while Navy fighters and anti-aircraft batteries accounted for the remainder. Less than 10% of the kamikaze aircraft succeeded in penetrating the defenses to mount successful attacks, underscoring the Corsair's vital contribution to fleet protection. The influence of the Corsair extended beyond U.S. forces, as several Allied nations incorporated the aircraft into their air arms. The British Royal Navy and the Royal New Zealand Air Force were among the earliest foreign operators, receiving new Corsairs directly from the factories. The first British Corsairs arrived in November 1943, and Royal Navy pilots were sent to the United States for training before joining the fleet. Despite facing similar challenges with carrier operations as the U.S. Navy, the British successfully deployed Corsairs from carriers from the outset. The high demand for the aircraft led United Aircraft to license production to Brewster and Goodyear, with many of the British units built under license. To accommodate carrier storage constraints, the British Corsairs were delivered with wings clipped by 8 inches. The Royal Navy deployed Corsairs in combat for the first time in April 1944, participating in a strike against the German battleship Tirpitz, which lay hidden in a Norwegian fjord. Soon afterward, British Corsairs operated in the Indian Ocean and eventually in the Pacific theater. By the war's final months, the Royal Navy had equipped 13 squadrons with 225 Corsairs, operating them from carriers in airstrikes over bypassed Japanese-held islands, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. Notably, Lieutenant Robert Hampton Gray, a Canadian flying with the Royal Navy, was awarded the Victoria Cross for his daring attack on a Japanese destroyer off Honshu on August 9, 1945, highlighting the Corsair's lethal versatility in the hands of skilled pilots. New Zealand also became a significant operator of the F4U, receiving over 400 aircraft and fielding its first operational squadron in May 1944 from Espiritu Santo. With Japanese strongholds like Rabaul bypassed, Kiwi Corsairs were primarily assigned to ground attack missions against isolated Japanese positions on remote islands, continuing the role pioneered by U.S. Marine squadrons in the Central and South Pacific. France would eventually become another key operator of the Corsair, though French use began after the end of World War II. Initially receiving a number of former U.S. Marine Corsairs that had served in the Pacific, France later contracted with Chance-Vought for 94 new aircraft, with production lines reopened between 1952 and 1953. This post-war production ensured that the F4U Corsair enjoyed the longest operational and production history of any U.S. piston-engine fighter, cementing its legacy as one of the most successful and adaptable military aircraft ever built. The Corsair's extraordinary combat record, coupled with its post-war service with multiple Allied nations, stands as a testament to its design excellence, versatility, and enduring impact on aerial warfare. Despite the widespread reputation of the F4U Corsair as perhaps the finest Allied fighter of World War II, its combat record is more nuanced than popular accounts suggest. U.S. Marine and Navy Corsair pilots were officially credited with destroying 2,140 Japanese aircraft, and statistics from the Pacific War indicate an impressive kill-loss ratio of 11-1, which on the surface appears to be the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter in the theater. However, these figures can be misleading, as the Corsair's opportunities for air-to-air combat were heavily concentrated during the early campaigns in the Solomons and at Rabaul. Once the war shifted northward toward the Central Pacific, Corsair squadrons encountered far fewer enemy aircraft in the skies and were increasingly assigned to ground attack missions, reducing their exposure to aerial combat. The majority of the top Corsair aces achieved their scores between August 1942, following the invasion of Guadalcanal, and January 1944, when Japanese airpower over Rabaul had been largely neutralized. After that period, the Corsair's role shifted almost exclusively to ground attacks, close air support, and fleet defense, aside from a brief resurgence of air-to-air combat during the Leyte campaign in December 1944. Even when Marine Corsair units were tasked with defending the fleet against kamikaze attacks, the enemy pilots were primarily focused on suicidal strikes rather than traditional air combat maneuvers, further skewing the kill-loss ratio. While the Corsair demonstrated remarkable lethality, the aircraft also had a notoriously high accident rate. Of the total F4U losses during the war, only 189 were attributed to air-to-air combat, while 349 were destroyed by ground fire, but an astonishing 692 aircraft were lost due to non-combat accidents. Operational mishaps during combat claimed an additional 230 planes, a reflection of both the Corsair's demanding handling characteristics and the challenging conditions in which it operated. Nonetheless, the F4U Corsair would go on to secure a unique place in aviation history as the only American fighter produced during World War II to continue in operational service after the war ended. While production of other frontline fighters such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat ceased, Corsair production extended into the 1950s, primarily supporting the Navy and Marine Corps in the ground attack role. The Navy even adapted the aircraft for night fighting, a niche in which Lieutenant Guy Bordelon distinguished himself by shooting down 5 enemy aircraft during the Korean War, making him both the only Navy ace of that conflict and the last known propeller-driven ace in history. The Corsair also earned fame for extraordinary and unconventional kills in combat. One notable example involved Marine Lieutenant R.R. Klingman during operations off Okinawa. Attempting to intercept a twin-engine Japanese bomber at high altitude, Klingman found that his guns had iced over in the extreme cold and would not fire. Rather than allow the enemy plane to escape, potentially to strike an Allied vessel, he maneuvered his Corsair behind the bomber and deliberately struck it with his propeller, slicing off the tail. The bomber spiraled out of control and crashed, and although Klingman lost 5 inches of his propeller, he managed to land safely and was awarded the Navy Cross for the mission. This was not an isolated incident. The very first Japanese plane shot down by a Corsair resulted from a mid-air collision, highlighting the daring and sometimes improvisational tactics employed by Corsair pilots. Even after World War II, the F4U Corsair continued to serve in the air forces of multiple nations through the 1950s and 1960s. While the U.S. Navy retired the type after the Korean War, French Corsairs saw action in Indochina and Algeria. Remarkably, the Corsair's combat career extended as late as 1969 during the brief conflict between El Salvador and Honduras, making it one of the longest-serving propeller-driven fighters in history. Across decades, multiple theaters, and a variety of combat roles, from air superiority and kamikaze interception to ground attack and night fighting, the F4U Corsair proved itself a versatile and formidable aircraft, earning a legacy that endured far beyond its wartime debut.